The rain came not as a cleansing but as a punishment, each drop a cold, hard stone hurled from a bruised and swollen sky. It clawed at the woman's thin dress, plastering the worn fabric to her skin and stealing the last of her warmth. She held a child's hand in each of hers, their small fingers slick and icy. The boy, Finn, stumbled, his face a pale mask of exhaustion in the gloom, while the girl, Cora, a dead weight in her other arm, had long since surrendered to a fitful, whimpering sleep. The world had dissolved into a roaring torrent of wind and water, a churning chaos that mirrored the one she fled. Her breath was a ragged tear in her lungs. Every shadow was a hand reaching for her, every howl of the wind a voice she'd thought left miles behind. The mud sucked at her bare feet, a greedy mouth trying to pull her down into the earth. Then, through the grey curtain of the deluge, a light. It was small, a pinprick of defiant yellow in the vast, indifferent darkness. It was a house. A sanctuary or a trap, she did not know, but her legs made the choice for her. They gave out at the foot of a rough-hewn fence post, and she crumpled into the mire, pulling her children down with her. She shielded Cora's head with her body, murmuring broken words into Finn's hair as his small body trembled against hers. The light grew, bobbing and swaying, resolving itself into a lantern held in a large hand. A figure loomed over them, a shape made of canvas and shadow, broad and tall. She flinched, curling tighter around her children, a wounded animal preparing for the final blow. She could not see his face, only the stoic set of a jaw illuminated from below. He said nothing. The silence was more terrifying than a shout. He simply stood there, the rain dripping from the brim of his hat, watching them. Then he knelt, the movement slow, deliberate, unthreatening. He did not reach for her. He reached for the boy, his voice a low rumble beneath the storm's fury. His cold, it wasn't a question. It was a fact, stated as plainly as the rain was wet. He held out a hand, palm up, to Finn. The boy looked from the hand to his mother's face, seeking permission. She could give none. There was no strength left for choices. The man, Silas, scooped the boy into one arm as if he weighed nothing, then gently, so gently, took the sleeping girl from her grasp. He looked at her then, his eyes finding hers in the flickering light. He still said nothing. He just turned and walked toward the light, leaving her to follow. And she did, pulling herself from the mud, one agonizing step at a time, toward the promise of a door. The smell of wood smoke and drying wool filled the small cabin. It was a clean, honest smell that felt alien on her tongue. Ilara sat on a low stool by the hearth, a thick blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching the man. Silas. He had told her his name once, in that same low, steady voice, before turning his attention to the children. He had stripped their wet clothes and wrapped them in soft, worn linens, placing them on a pallet of furs before the fire. Now he moved about the single room with a quiet economy, his large frame never seeming to break the stillness. He ladled stew from a black iron pot into two small bowls, the scent of herbs and meat a painful reminder of how long it had been since they had eaten a real meal. He placed the bowls on the floor beside the sleeping children, along with a cup of water for when they woke. He did all of this without looking at her, yet she felt the weight of his awareness. She was a feral thing brought in from the storm, and every muscle in her body was coiled to spring. Her gaze darted from his hands, calloused and capable as they stirred the fire, to the heavy wooden door, to the rifle mounted on pegs above the mantelpiece. Safety and danger lived side by side in this room, and she did not yet know which one owned this man. He finally turned to her, a third bowl in his hands. He did not approach her directly but set it on the edge of the hearth, a safe distance between them. "Eat," he said. The word was not a command, but a simple statement of need. She stared at the steam rising from the bowl. Her stomach clenched with a hunger so fierce it was a physical pain, but her hands would not move. They remained clenched in the rough wool of the blanket. He seemed to understand. He didn't press. He took his own bowl and sat in a straight-backed chair across the room, his back to the wall, his posture one of patient waiting. He ate slowly, his eyes on the fire, giving her the gift of his inattention. Minutes stretched, marked only by the crackle of the logs and the soft breathing of her children. Slowly, hesitantly, her hand crept from beneath the blanket. Her fingers trembled as she picked up the spoon. The first bite was agony and bliss. She ate like a starving wolf, not tasting, just consuming, her eyes never leaving him. He finished his meal, set the bowl aside, and began mending a piece of leather harness, his hands working with a focused, rhythmic grace. He was a creature of purpose and quiet. He did not ask her name. He did not ask where she came from or what she was running from. He had taken them in, fed them, and now he was leaving them be. The firelight danced on his weathered face, carving deep lines around his eyes. They were the eyes of a man who spent his days looking at the horizon, comfortable with distance, comfortable with silence. For the first time in a long time, the knot of terror in Ilara's chest loosened, just a fraction. Days bled into a week, then two. A silent routine took root in the thin soil of their cohabitation. Silas would rise before the sun, his movements quiet so as not to wake them. The smell of coffee and frying bacon would gently pull Ilara from a shallow, watchful sleep. He would leave food on the table, a plate for her, two smaller plates for the children, and then he would be gone, out into the vast, wind-scoured landscape that surrounded the cabin. From the single window, she watched him. He moved with the land, a part of its rugged fabric. He mended fences that stretched to the horizon, his form a distant, solitary speck. He tended to his few cattle and two sturdy horses, his voice a low murmur as he worked. He was a man rooted in his tasks, and his consistency became a strange sort of comfort. He was always there, and he was always at a distance. Inside the cabin, Ilara began to build her own small world. At first, she and the children barely moved from the hearth, a tiny island in an unknown sea. Finn, who had been silent and withdrawn since their arrival, began to whisper stories to his little sister. Cora, resilient in the way of the very young, would crawl to the door and watch a sliver of the world through the crack at the bottom. Ilara began to take over the small domestic chores. She swept the hearth, washed the bowls, folded the blankets. Each task was a small reclamation of herself, a way to impose order on the chaos that still churned inside her. She was paying her way, earning her keep. That was a language she understood. They spoke very little. Their communication was a pantomime of necessity. He would leave a bucket of water by the door, she would leave a mended shirt on his chair. She would point to the dwindling flour sack, the next day, a new sack would appear on the porch. One afternoon, he came in earlier than usual, holding the small wooden doll Cora had dropped and broken during their flight. One of its legs had snapped off. He sat at the table, took a small knife and a pot of glue from a shelf, and began to work. Ilara watched from her stool, her hands twisting in her lap. The children stood by his elbow, their eyes wide with awe. He worked with intense concentration, his large, rough fingers surprisingly deft. He carved a tiny wooden peg to bind the pieces, applied the glue with the tip of his knife, and then wrapped the leg tightly with a piece of twine. He set it on the mantel to dry. "There," he said, looking at Cora. The girl gave him a shy, hesitant smile, the first she had offered him. He simply nodded and went back outside. Ilara felt a strange warmth spread through her chest. It wasn't just the doll. He was mending things. He was showing her, without words, that what is broken can be fixed. The snap of the branch was as loud as a gunshot in the afternoon stillness. One of the horses, tethered near the small copse of trees where Silas was splitting wood, shied violently, its eyes rolling white with panic. It reared, its powerful front legs lashing the air, its tether straining against the post. In the cabin, Ilara was kneading dough, her hands finally finding a familiar, comforting rhythm. At the sound, her entire body went rigid. The loud crack, the sudden, violent movement, it was a combination that ripped through the fragile piece she had been building. Her hands flew to her mouth to stifle a scream, the flour dusting her face like a ghostly mask. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps. She was no longer in the quiet cabin. She was back in a dark room, the air thick with the smell of whiskey and rage, a man's shadow falling over her, a belt raised high. Her instinct screamed one word, run. She backed away from the table, her eyes wide with terror, stumbling over the small stool. She looked wildly around the room, her gaze falling on her children playing quietly by the fire. She had to get them. She had to hide them. Outside, Silas had the horse under control. He spoke in a low, soothing monotone, his hand firm on its neck, stroking its hide until its trembling subsided. "Easy now." Steady, his voice was a calm anchor in the sudden storm. When the animal was quiet, he turned, his brow furrowed with concern, his eyes instinctively seeking the cabin window. He saw her face, pale and stricken, and he understood immediately. Her fear was not for the horse. It was something deeper, something old and ugly. He let go of the reins and started toward the cabin, his long strides eating up the ground. Then he stopped. He saw the way she was pressed against the far wall, her arms wrapped around herself, her body shaking. He saw the pure, animal terror in her eyes. He knew that his approach, his size, his very presence would be a threat. So he did the one thing that went against his own instinct to help. He stopped moving. He stood perfectly still in the middle of the yard, about 20 paces from the door. He slowly, deliberately, placed his axe on the chopping block. He held his empty hands out to his sides, palms forward, showing her he held no weapon, no threat. He just stood there, waiting. He did not call her name. He did not offer empty reassurances. He simply gave her space, time, and stillness. He waited for her to come back to the present, to see that he was just a man in a yard, and that the only danger was the ghost in her own mind. The first frost arrived overnight, a delicate silver filigree tracing the edges of every blade of grass and dusting the cabin roof. Autumn had laid its claim on the land. The endless green of the prairie had mellowed to 100 shades of gold and amber, and the sky, once a pale, sun-bleached blue, had deepened to a rich, crisp cobalt. The change in season brought a change in the rhythm of their lives, a new and urgent sense of shared purpose. Winter was coming, and winter in this part of the country was not a guest but a conqueror. There was wood to be split and stacked, a mountain of it against the cabin's northern wall. There were late vegetables to be harvested from the small garden Silas had tilled, and jars to be filled with preserves. For the first time, Elara began to work outside the confines of the cabin walls. She started by gathering fallen branches for kindling, always keeping the house in sight, her movements skittish and uncertain. Silas never watched her directly, but she knew he was aware of her, positioning his own work to be nearby but not too close. He gave her tasks that created a bubble of autonomy around her. "The beans need picking," he said one morning, gesturing toward the garden with his chin. She spent the day in the sun, the dry rustle of the beanstalks a soothing sound, her fingers growing stained and sore. The work was honest and grounding. It left no room for the ghosts. She brought in basket after basket, and that evening, they sat at the table together, the children sleeping soundly, and shelled the beans in companionable silence. Their hands moved in a steady rhythm, the beans rattling into the large metal bowl between them. It was a partnership, unspoken and unacknowledged, but deeply felt. She learned the weight and balance of the axe, splitting smaller logs for the hearth while he wrestled with the larger rounds. Her arms ached, and her palms blistered, but a sense of strength began to kindle within her. She was not just a survivor, she was a provider. One afternoon, while they were repairing a section of the roof before the first snow, he spoke without looking at her, his voice nearly lost in the wind. "My wife, she couldn't take the quiet out here," he paused, hammering a shingle into place with 3 precise blows. "The silence has a way of making you listen to what's inside you." He said nothing more, but the small confidence was a gift. He was telling her he understood. He knew the silence wasn't empty. For her, it had been filled with fear. But now, working beside him under the vast autumn sky, she was beginning to hear something else in it, the whisper of peace. The first snow fell softly, each flake a perfect, intricate star, blanketing the world in a pristine silence. Inside the cabin, the air was warm and thick with the scent of baking bread. Finn and Cora were tracing patterns on the frosted windowpane, their quiet laughter a sound that had become more frequent in recent weeks. Elara slid the golden brown loaves from the small oven built into the side of the stone hearth, her movements now confident and familiar. She glanced over at Silas, who was sitting at the table, meticulously carving a small piece of pine. He did this most evenings, his knife peeling away delicate curls of wood to reveal the shape hidden within. Tonight, it was a horse, its head arched, its mane a fantastically detailed cascade. Finn had gone to him, his small face serious. "Can you make it run faster?" he had asked, pointing a chubby finger at the wooden creature. Silas had looked down at the boy, a flicker of something soft in his eyes. He considered the horse for a moment, then made a tiny, careful adjustment to the angle of its legs with his knife. "There," he rumbled. "Now he's faster than the wind." Finn had gasped in delight, convinced of the magic. He took the horse and galloped it across the floorboards, making his own whooshing sound effects. Cora toddled after him, giggling. Elara watched them, a genuine smile touching her lips, a rare and fragile thing. It felt strange on her face, like using a muscle she'd forgotten she possessed. Her eyes met Silas's across the room. He wasn't looking at the children anymore, he was looking at her. At her smile. He didn't smile back, but the intensity in his gaze was more profound than any grin. It was a look of deep, quiet satisfaction of seeing a wounded bird finally test its wings. The moment was broken by Finn, who tripped over his own feet and sent the wooden horse skittering under the table. He let out a frustrated wail. Elara moved to comfort him, but Silas was already there. He knelt, his large body folding down to the boy's level, and retrieved the toy. He inspected it for damage with the utmost seriousness. "He's all right," he said to Finn. Just a little startled, he handed the horse back, and Finn's tears vanished as quickly as they had come. Elara felt a wave of emotion so powerful it made her dizzy. It was the simple, paternal tenderness of the act. He was not just a protector, he was a gentle guardian. That night, after the children were asleep, she found a second carving on the mantelpiece, placed next to Cora's mended doll. It was a tiny, intricately carved bird, its wings half spread, as if it were just about to take flight. The stranger's horse was a dark blot against the endless white of the snow-covered plains, growing steadily larger as it approached the cabin. Visitors were a rarity, an unwelcome disruption to the delicate ecosystem of peace they had built. Elara saw him first, her hand freezing on the water pump. A knot of ice formed in her stomach. Every stranger was a potential threat, a link to the world that had tried to destroy her. She hurried inside, her face a pale, tight mask. "Someone's coming," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The children, sensing her fear, fell silent and scurried to her side, their small hands clutching at her skirt. Silas was cleaning his rifle at the table, a routine task of maintenance. He looked up, his expression unreadable, and followed her gaze out the window. He watched the rider for a long moment, his movements unhurried as he reassembled the firearm with practiced efficiency. He didn't load it. He simply placed it back on its rack above the mantel. "It's just Jed. Trades furs," he said, his voice calm and steady, a deliberate counterpoint to her rising panic. "Stays for coffee." Once a winter he was trying to reassure her, but her body wouldn't listen. She retreated to the darkest corner of the room, pulling the children with her, effectively trying to melt into the shadows. When the heavy knock came at the door, she flinched as if struck. Silas opened it, letting in a blast of cold air and a large, boisterous man with a beard full of ice. "Silas, you old hermit," the man boomed, his voice filling the small cabin, shattering the quiet. "Good to see you ain't been eaten by a bear." Jed stomped the snow from his boots and strode in, his eyes quickly taking in the scene, the woman and children huddled in the corner. His gaze was curious, his smile faltering for a second. "Well now," he said, his voice softer. "Looks like you got company." As Silas moved to block his view, stepping between the visitor and his fragile family. "They're staying with me," Silas said. His tone was level, but it carried an unmistakable weight of finality. It was not an explanation, it was a wall. He gestured toward the coffeepot on the hearth. "Coffee's hot, Jed. Let's talk about those pelts." He guided the man to the table, keeping his body positioned as a shield. He kept the conversation focused on traps and weather and the price of skins, his low voice a constant, reassuring rumble. He never once looked over at Ilara, but she felt his protection as surely as if he had wrapped a blanket around her. He was guarding her silence, her anonymity, her safety. An hour later, Jed was gone, a small sack of coffee and sugar left on the table in trade. The silence he left behind was profound, a welcome balm. Silas closed the door and turned to her. He didn't ask if she was all right. He didn't need to. He simply met her gaze, and in his eyes, she saw a promise. "You are safe here." And for the first time, she believed it with her entire soul. The wind howled around the corners of the cabin, a mournful, lonely sound that scraped at the edges of Ilara's frayed nerves. Another storm had descended, a mirror of the one that had first delivered her to this doorstep months ago. The children slept, oblivious, but for Ilara, the storm dredged up the past, pulling it from the depths where she tried so hard to keep it buried. The security she had painstakingly built felt like a house of cards in the face of the gale. She was a burden. A stray he had taken in out of pity. She and her children ate his food, slept under his roof, consumed his resources. What had she given in return? Mended shirts and baked bread. It was not a fair trade. In the world she had known, a woman always paid her debts, usually with her body, with her spirit, with her pain. The man she had run from had taught her that lesson with his fists and his belt. He had owned her, and the price of his protection was her submission. She looked at Silas, sitting by the fire, his face stoic in the flickering light. He had never asked for anything. He had never raised his voice, never made a sudden move, never looked at her with anything other than a quiet, respectful solemnity. His kindness was so absolute, so alien, that it felt like a debt she could never repay. It had to be a trick. The other shoe had to drop. The churning guilt and fear finally spilled over. She stood up, her movement stiff, and walked to the center of the room. He looked up, his expression questioning. Her voice, when it came, was a raw, broken thing, a sound torn from the deepest part of her. "I am a weight on you," she began, her hands twisting the fabric of her dress. "I have nothing. I have brought you nothing but trouble." He started to speak, to deny it, but she held up a hand, her eyes wild with a desperate, self-destructive resolve. She had to make the offer. She had to name the transaction she understood. It was the only way to balance the scales, to make sense of his gentle strength. "I know what is owed," she whispered, her body beginning to tremble violently. "I know how these things work. You've been kind. But you don't have to be. You can take what you're due." She took a deep, shuddering breath, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. She forced herself to meet his gaze, to show him she was not afraid, a lie so profound it threatened to tear her in two. "You can whip me if you must." The hideous words hung in the air between them, an offering of pain, a testament to the horrors that had shaped her. She braced herself, her shoulders hunched, her head bowed, ready for the strike she believed was inevitable. The silence that followed her words was absolute, deeper and more profound than any quiet the cabin had ever known. The only sounds were the raging wind outside and the frantic, terrified drumming of her own heart. Silas did not move. He simply stared at her, his face a mask of stone, but his eyes held a storm of their own. It was not anger. It was a deep, aching sorrow, a grief so palpable it seemed to suck the very air from the room. He was looking at her as if she were a beautiful thing that someone had deliberately, cruelly smashed to pieces. The sight of his pain, a pain he felt for her, was more undoing than any blow would have been. He slowly, deliberately, set the piece of wood he had been carving on the floor beside his chair. He rose to his feet, his movements measured and graceful, every motion telegraphing his intent so she would not be startled. He was a mountain of a man, capable of immense force, but he made himself seem smaller, less threatening. He did not approach her. He stayed by his chair, keeping the wide expanse of the hearth between them. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with an emotion she could not name, a voice that felt scraped raw. "Ilara," he said. It was the first time he had used her name, and the sound of it in his mouth was both a shock and a comfort. "Look at me." She lifted her head, her eyes blurred with unshed tears. His gaze was steady, unwavering, and filled with a tenderness that was almost unbearable. "There is no debt here," he said, each word a carefully laid stone in the foundation of a new reality. "There are no scales to balance. There is only this room. This fire." As he took a half-step forward, his hands held open at his sides. "What you ran from is not here. That life is not here. That man is not here." He paused, letting the truth of his words settle in the space between them. The wind rattled the window pane, a faint echo of the violence she had invoked. Then he delivered his promise, a quiet vow that would remake her world. "I'll only wrap you in my arms." The words were not a proposition or a demand. They were an offering. A shelter. A final, definitive answer to the brutal question her past had taught her to ask. He still didn't move toward her, giving her the power. The choice was hers. To stay in the past, braced for pain, or to step forward into the quiet safety he offered. Tears she hadn't known she was holding back began to fall, silent, hot tracks down her flour-dusted cheeks. They were tears of grief for the woman she had been, the one who believed pain was the only price for survival. And they were tears of a fragile, terrifying hope for the woman she might become. His words, "I'll only wrap you in my arms," were a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for years. They didn't just promise an absence of pain, they promised the presence of comfort, of solace, of a kindness so pure it felt sacred. She stood frozen for a long moment, caught between two worlds. The muscle memory of fear was a powerful current, telling her to recoil, to deny the offer, to see it as another, more subtle kind of trap. But his eyes held no deception. They were as clear and honest as the winter sky after a storm. He was offering her a gift with no strings attached, and the sheer grace of it was overwhelming. Slowly, hesitantly, as if waking from a long and terrible dream, she took a single, shuffling step toward him. Then another. The space between them, which had moments before been a chasm of fear and misunderstanding, now felt charged with a different kind of energy. It was a sacred ground of healing. With each step, she felt the rigid armor she had worn for so long begin to crack and fall away. She was not just moving toward him, she was moving toward a version of herself she thought was gone forever. When she was finally standing before him, she stopped, her head bowed, still not daring to fully believe. He did not reach for her. He waited. He was giving her final and complete control. With a shudder that racked her entire body, she lifted her gaze to his and gave him a nearly imperceptible nod. Only then did he move. He raised his arms, slowly, and gently enveloped her. It was not a lover's embrace, full of passion or possession. It was a shelter. His arms were strong and solid around her, a fortress against the howling wind and the howling ghosts of her past. She leaned her forehead against his chest, the rough wool of his shirt scratching her cheek, the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart a grounding drumbeat beneath her ear. And she wept. She cried for all the years of fear, for the pain, for the loneliness, for the woman who had been forced to offer herself up for whipping. He just held her, one hand stroking her hair, his silence a comforting weight, a promise that he could absorb her sorrow without breaking. In the warmth of his arms, under the shelter of his quiet strength, Ilara was not just being held. She was being remade. The storm outside could rage all it wanted. The storm inside was finally, blessedly, beginning to calm.